Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Henry, I think you made a great point on transparency. A part of what we have to do is we can have a different discussion about fees and whatever you want to call them. But I think it's fair to say I can't imagine any reasonable member of Congress not saying, I want the person to know what their financial obligation is when they sign an instrument, not after they read page 10 in the fine print. So I stipulate that. I want to support our work on that. We have similar issues in healthcare, a number of other areas where we need transparency. And Ms. Siegel, your point on the rent, I'm less caught up in whether or not a trash collection fee is appropriate or not, and more caught up in does that renter know at the point in time they're signing a lease what they're expected to pay every month. It's another example of transparency. We can discuss the fees. I mean, if one fee goes away, the rent could go up. We know that at the end of the day, they're going to try and collect enough to manage their risk and pay their own bills, the landlords. So I agree with that. I think that practice is wrong. But I'm still concerned with and we've had several references in the opening statements about the CFP could do this or could do that. But I personally think they have a scattershot and ill-defined regulatory approach right now. Mr. Johnson, can you talk about the effect of the method that the CFPB is using to go after this and the impact that it could have, the negative implications it has?
Well, thank you, Senator. I mean, the use of the phrase scattershot, I think, is apt with respect to the approach that the CFPB is using. To have any chance of success in a regulation, from my experience at the agency, you have to carefully identify a market failure. You have to come up with a proposal that's narrowly tailored to address the root causes of that market failure. And you have to undergo careful cost-benefit analysis to determine whether or not your solution is going to be worse than the problem to begin with. And so there are many unintended consequences that come when agencies cut corners, and a scattershot approach will have those unintended consequences.
One unintended consequence could be reducing underbanking or unbanking certain people because you've reached a point where it's no longer fiscally viable for a product or service to be offered to a certain segment of the population. Is that one?
Absolutely. There's a long-standing trade-off between price and access.
Yep. Is the CFPB a prudential regulator?
It has no safety and soundness mission. It's a market conduct regulator like the SEC or FTC, who are appropriated by Congress.
If you take a look at the CFPB's efforts on overdraft fees as an example, after the 2008 financial crisis, some regulators under the Obama administration emphasized reliability and countercyclical nature of overdraft revenue as an appropriate tool for ensuring the stability of the bank's balance sheets. Some at the Federal Reserve went so far as to express a desire to see overdraft revenue when grading banks on well-known Camel's rating system. Yet now the CFPB has undertaken a name and shame campaign to coerce banks who were following the established prudential standards for the crime of listening to their previous federal regulators. So does the CFPB have the proper jurisdiction, resources, or staff to make prudential regulatory decisions?
No.
Is the CFPB's tendency to name and shame business institutions to avoid certain practices or adopt new ones effective regulation?
It's not, and I would add that, this tactic of using the implied threat of investigation to coerce lawful businesses to change their practices for political purposes should be condemned.
Do you believe the Bureau thinks these implications are conducts sufficient analysis on the follow-on effects of their junk fee regulations? Or you more or less answered that in a prior question. They're not really thinking through the full impact and all the potential unintended consequences. Can you think of any example under this current leadership of the CFPB where they have taken that into consideration?
Well, I mean, they are moving forward at least with the rulemaking and credit card late fees, but the problem with that rulemaking is the Bureau admits that it lacks the evidence to understand the effect that the regulation will have on small card issuers. And rather than going to get that evidence through, for instance, a SABRIFA panel, it simply declined to do so.
Mr. Chair, I thank you all for your testimony. Mr. Chair, I'd like to submit for the record a letter from the Consumer Bankers Association on the subject.
Without objection.
Thank you.
So I'd like to go back to something that Attorney General Henry was talking about earlier. You talked about the case in Pennsylvania where a finance company allegedly